So the topic that we are going to discuss in today's lecture is cloud security. So when we think about networks, computer networks, and network security, one of the most common types of networks, or one of the most common things that you would encounter when we think about networking these days is the prevalence of cloud computing. So you would have studied, or like you would have come across different aspects of cloud computing in the past from experience or from other courses or different places. But as something that is related to networking, or as a computing that combines a significant aspect of networking. So cloud computing also presents a certain specific challenges, certain specific threats, and related countermeasures that are suitable to address those threats when we think about security. So we'll discuss about some of those things in today's lesson. So if we start by defining cloud computing, or identifying what is cloud computing, or what we think of cloud computing. So this is a more formal definition, but if you think about it, it is essentially we are having computing resources. So anything that we can identify as a computing resource, it could be processing capability, it could be network communication, it could be storage, it could be even like specialized processing like GPUs or any computing resource. And that those resources are pooled together by a service provider and then provisioned to those who need those resources on a on-demand or needs basis. So the service provider will, if we think about storage, for example, the service provider will have a set of storage available, and when a user or of that service needs a particular amount of storage, they can get and use it. And if they want to increase it, they can increase. If they want to decrease, they can decrease. So that on-demand provision is also an important aspect of this. So that is essentially what we identify as cloud computing. So that is something that most of you would be familiar with. Then within cloud computing, there are a few things that we can identify. So first one is how that cloud computing environment is set up, in what sort of a deployment model it is set up. So we have public clouds. So this is where we talk about, say, cloud service providers like Amazon or Google, Microsoft Azure. So these type of cloud service providers are essentially public cloud service providers, because they provide the cloud computing capability through in a sort of a public facing manner. Then you can have private cloud computing as well. So again, you use the same technologies for resource pooling and provision of resources, but you set up that in a private environment. So it doesn't have to be in a local area network. It can be, as we have discussed about how we can have private wide area networks through VPNs and all these other things. So we can have private clouds that are only used by an organization, for example. Then we have hybrid clouds, community clouds. So these are again slight variations of how and the resources, or who are the participants in that cloud deployment. Then in terms of the services that are provided through cloud computing models, again, we can see a number of different variations. So we can start with things like infrastructure as a service. So when we think about infrastructure as a service, it is essentially where you get the basic computing infrastructure, like the processing capabilities or storage capabilities. Those are what we identify as infrastructure as a service. And on top of that, we will run all the software resources and utilize the cloud computing capability. Platform as a service add some software capabilities, like most likely an operating system environment or something of that nature, and then that is provisioned to the users. Software as a service is more specific software products being provisioned to users who need them. For example, email services or online-based or cloud-based Office packages like Google Docs and things like that. So those are things that we can identify as software as a service. So this is another layer that we can use to sort of classify cloud computing in terms of what are the service models. Then the main sort of common thing that we will encounter across all of these would be some of these essential or common characteristics of all cloud environments. And the main one being resource pooling. So that is, we will have, or the service provider, whoever is having the cloud infrastructure, will have a certain amount of resources. But they will first pool those resources together before sharing it again with the end users. Say, for example, if they have, say, 1,000 computers, first they will pool together all the computing capabilities, and then it will be provisioned on a needs basis. And when we have pooled together all the resources, then we will have certain other additional things. One is on-demand self-service. So if you think about Google or Amazon or Microsoft or whatever, any cloud service providers, you can simply go and create a cloud machine and use it for your own needs. So there's no other interventions, there's no additional admins or anything. It is fully automated process there. And those resources that you ask for that particular service can be measured. That you can say, I want a computer with this particular processing capabilities, this amount of RAM, this amount of storage, and everything you can particularly specify. So we can have a measured service like that. So we can specify what exactly we need, and that is the resource that will be given to us. Then another aspect is rapid elasticity, which is where we are able to expand that resource on a needs basis. Say, for example, we may start with a particular configuration of a computing resource, but if we need more capability in that computing resource, we can increase its capabilities, or we can increase the processing capability and all those things, again, without much hassle. And another main aspect is the ability for us to access these resources from across the network. So it will have a wider network accessibility to these resources. So these are some of the common characteristics that we will have when we think about cloud computing resources or cloud computing environments. So if we think about an enterprise environment, so that is where we are most likely to think about these cloud computing situations, we will come across a typical setup where we will have our own enterprise network that would be as the same as what we would have covered in previous courses, like we could have local area networks, we could have wide area networks, and all those things would be similar. But in addition to that, we will have a cloud service provider. Sometimes it could be an internal cloud, a private cloud, but generally it could be a third-party cloud service provider that would be providing or housing all the resources, all the computing resources necessary for the cloud aspect of that enterprise. And the end users, the cloud users from the enterprise would be connecting through some network, again, most likely through the internet. So that would be a typical setup or arrangement by which we will have our cloud computing when we are using our organizational network environment would look like when we are using cloud computing. So when we think about cloud computing, again, even though we have, so it is no longer, cloud computing is no longer sort of a new thing. It is, these days, it is very widely used, and most of the organizations that you may end up working at will use some aspect of cloud computing, and many of them will use a number of different aspects of cloud computing as well. So there are already well-established standards, well-established best practices that identify how things should be, what are the key aspects, and all these things. And one of the main preferences that we have, or standards that we have, is the NIST Cloud Computing Reference Architecture, which defines many of the key aspects relevant to cloud computing. So if we particularly look at the NIST architecture, here we can, in addition to some of the key aspects that we have looked at, like the different service layers and the hardware, the physical resources, and all those things. In addition to that, we need to have a number of key things. And one of the important aspects is security and privacy. And in addition to security and privacy, the key services relevant to that provided by the cloud service provider, there is also a need for having external auditing of these security practices, external auditing of these privacy practices, performance auditing, and all these things would also be there. And in some cases, we may also encounter cloud brokers where services from a number of different cloud providers are aggregated together and provided through another broker. So that would be a broader picture of different participants that we may encounter as per the cloud computing reference architecture. So the main thing that we are concerned is about the security aspects of cloud today, but also to have a better understanding of the overall picture of cloud computing and different aspects or different elements that you will encounter with the overall environment. So when we think about cloud providers, so cloud providers can again vary based on what they provide. They can provide different services for businesses. Some of them may provide many different services, and some of them may provide some services. Say, for example, if you think of cloud service providers like the larger providers like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and the likes, many of them would provide a large number of different services, like from the basic computing storage type services to additional AI-based services, very specific services as well. And some of them would be software as a service, some of them could be platform as a service, some of them could be infrastructure as a service. And you may come across a combination of these as well. And depending on which cloud service provider you are using, and sometimes you may use a combination of different cloud service providers in an organization environment because that's what you need. So that is also a possibility. Then we have the cloud carrier, and a cloud carrier is the infrastructure or the facility that we need to establish connectivity between the cloud providers and the cloud consumers. If we are an enterprise that is using the cloud computing capabilities from a cloud provider, then we need to have some networking facility that is interconnecting us with that cloud provider. Depending on the need, that may be some form of a private connection, that could be through the internet, but we still need to have some networking capability that is going to carry the transport and provide the connectivity between the cloud consumers and the cloud providers. Cloud auditor is essentially an independent entity that is going to perform checks on the cloud provider and check whether they conform to the set standards that were agreed upon between the cloud consumer and the cloud provider. And cloud brokers are essentially, again, another set of third-party providers who are going to make things easier for the end user. So if whatever that is directly provided by the cloud provider is maybe complex, maybe not everything that you need is available from a single provider, there may be cloud brokers who may aggregate these services and function as an intermediary between you and the cloud provider and provide those services in a more easily accessible manner. So now, when we think about in such sort of cloud computing environments, when we think about security risks, we can identify a number of common security threats when it comes to such cloud computing environments. And one of the most common one could be sort of abuse of cloud computing resources or misuse of cloud computing resources. So if people can say, for example, cloud service, through cloud services, you can easily get a lot of computing resources. And then you can use those computing resources to do a lot of malicious things. You can, say, for example, you can do spamming, or you can do DDoS attacks or whatever, because you can use those computing resources for anything. So there should be certain controls that the cloud computing capabilities are not misused for nefarious or bad purposes by bad actors. For example, Google may be providing the computing resources, and somebody could easily provision a machine there and then use that machine to launch an attack on a third party, because that would be much easier, because it is you don't have to, and if things go wrong, you can just leave that, because it's a virtual machine. You don't have to think anything about it. You stop paying for that, and that you're done with that. So you may actually, there are certain cloud service providers have certain limitations, mainly to address this. So for example, on Google Cloud Platform, GCP, when you normally provision a computing engine, essentially a virtual machine, normally you are not able to set up mail servers on that, because if we are able to set up mail servers, we can easily start sending spam emails. So to prevent that, as a measure to prevent that, they have disabled the ability to, or they have essentially blocked the networking through the standard mail ports, SMTP ports, to send out emails. So you are not able to send out emails by default. There are certain alternative measures you can do to address that, but they have made it a bit more difficult so that those resources are not misused. Then another challenge that you may encounter with cloud computing is malicious insiders. So this is essentially, again, applicable to any computing environment, any computer security scenario, but in this case also it is true. So when we think about so sort of human malicious insiders, any sort of human resources, because now we have a number of different parties that would employ these insiders in this sort of supply chain of computing. So for example, the cloud client, there will be certain human resources there. The cloud provider will have certain human resources, and if we use a cloud aggregator and someone, they may also have certain human resources. So we need to have compliance, checking, and all these things at all these levels, because that is, again, one of the more critical aspect where we can have security risks. Then when we particularly think about the technologies, the specific technology side of cloud computing, again, and there we can see certain risks as well. One is with the APIs and interfaces that are there as part of the cloud service provision by the cloud provider, those interfaces can have a security vulnerability. So if you have certain interfaces to provide provision new virtual machines or make modifications to those virtual machines, because all of these things are going to be carried out through these interfaces or these APIs, because these are not physically directly attached, directly connected computing resources, or everything is provisioned through systems. So all are accessible through these interfaces. So if there are vulnerabilities in that underlying API infrastructure interfaces, again, that could be a problematic thing. So again, those should be properly checked. There should be additional controls around authentication and access control. And there could be additional encryption and other aspects of security can also be employed here to further the level of protection that we can have. Then another aspect of security risk could come from the use of shared technologies. So again, when we think about a cloud provider, cloud computing environment, there could be a number of technologies that are not directly supplied by the cloud provider. Say, for example, if you provision a virtual machine with a particular operating system or additional software tools or various things, these could be technology that is provided by third parties. These could be technologies that are shared with third parties sometimes. So again, you need to have certain additional controls to manage these things, or rather manage any security vulnerabilities or security risks that may come about through this aspect. Then another aspect or a concern in many cloud environments is about what happens to the data that is available in this cloud environment, because the data is essentially being stored in some remote computing resource that is also in a way being shared with a number of other users. So how the access control is managed between different users? Are there any additional aspects of encryption or any anything to protect data when it is in transition? So all those things will have to be considered when we think about data loss or data leakage, because again, these are in a way they exist in a shared computing environment. So there could be potential risks in those environments as well. And one of the other key risk, one of the sort of, it is a more of a simple risk, but also a more critical risk is any cloud service that you may use, particularly the public clouds, are going to be managed through accounts that you are going to be administering. So there will be administrator accounts that you will use to manage these cloud services. So now one of the main vulnerabilities or risk factors would be about how you protect that account or access to that account. So the account credentials and using two-factor authentication and all these things could be deployed as countermeasures to prevent account or service hijacking type risks. And more than anything, one of the things to understand with, particularly with cloud computing, also applicable to any other computing environment, is the nature of unknown threats or unknown risks. That is, you can't always plan for only a set of risks, only a set of threats, and think that you have addressed those. You also have to think about all the other possible threats and have certain measures to continuously monitor and alert if things go wrong or things go above the standard operational norms. So again, you need to have certain measures to monitor and address those type of scenarios as well. Then another aspect of security in cloud computing environments, a key aspect of security in cloud computing environments is around data protection. And that also depends on what type of database environment or how we have set up the database or data storage in our cloud computing environment. So there are a few different ways that we may set up these in our cloud computing environment. One is known as a multi-instance model. The other one is known as a multi-tenant model. Whereas in a multi-instance model, what happens is each database would be running on a separate virtual machine for each cloud user. So each cloud user will have a separate virtual machine for their own database, and they will have all the controls over that particular instance of the database, or with the instance of the computing resource as well. Whereas on a multi-tenant model, this could be shared, or but there would be additional controls to separate the data that that belongs to a different user or different instance. So there should be additional measures being taken when we are using a multi-tenant model, but there may be reasons around efficiency or economical reasons why sometimes that may be chosen over a multi-instance model when it comes to data storage. And it's not just data that is at rest or that is stored in these computing resources, but it is also about data when it is being used, that is when it is being processed, and also when it is being in transit. So that is when it is coming into the computing resource, in a cloud computing resource, and when it is going out of the computing resource. We have to think about data protection in those scenarios as well. And we can have a number of different approaches. One of the key measures that we can use is encryption. We can have encryption in transit. We can also use encryption for data at rest. And we'll have to again to have certain measures around how we manage these encryption keys and things like that. But that is also that is one of the main countermeasures or main aspects that we will utilize when it comes to data protection in the cloud. So when we think about using encryption in a cloud-based database environment, we have to have certain additional capabilities there, because these are not sort of one-to-one encrypted, like one user is going to encrypt and the other ones who are going to use the resource as well, because these resources could also be shared. Because the nature of cloud-based applications and things like that, that may also be necessary. So then we'll have to have certain additional infrastructure like query processing, where we may have the encryption or decryption capabilities being performed, and before it is being stored in the database and things like that. So we need to the overall infrastructure that we normally identify in a database environment will be slightly different when we use cloud-based databases and encryption environment. So this is going to be again very common across many of these cloud computing environments. They are largely similar to the typical understanding of computing that we have, but also they have their own quirks, they have their own slight differences that are needed to cater to the nature of the infrastructure, the nature of the setup of cloud computing infrastructures. Actually, this is something you must be very familiar with in terms of relational databases. So then when we think about cloud security, an important development in the recent times is the aspect of cloud security as a service, or security as a service. So because the way that we also get all these other cloud aspect as a, like platforms or infrastructure as a service or software as a service, security capabilities can also be provided as a service. So there can be a number of different things. Say, for example, we can use identity and access management capabilities from a cloud provider. We can use things like data loss prevention, particularly things like email security, where we can do email scanning or spam mail prevention. All these services can be provided as security as services in the overall cloud environment. So many of the security activities that we can do in a standard manner can also be provided as a service on the cloud infrastructure, particularly for the all the computing capabilities that we have, all the software services that we have in those cloud environments. So what we can have is, as a cloud service client, we'll have to go through this the interface that we'll have to access all these resources will be through the cloud security interface, which will do all the intrusion management or provide all these things and manage all those resources and provide all the security capabilities that are needed for those resources. So with most of the major cloud service providers, when you look at their provisions, they provide a number of services that are particularly geared towards security implementations, particularly things around IAM or identity access management, particularly around encryption services, quite a bit of network security services. So there are different services that you may encounter in this realm as well. So then when we think about cloud computing and cloud security, we can look at a number of number of aspects that we'll have to perform, and that can be categorized and into different categories. So there are certain tasks, certain functions that are relevant to more technical functions. Some are more operational and some are more management related functions. So when we think about implementing a more robust, secure cloud infrastructure in an enterprise environment, we'll have to carry out these different tasks as well. So for example, in a more technical space, it could be around access control, auditing, identity and authentication, communication protection. So all these things will come under more of the technical functionalities or technical capabilities. The more operational sense, things around awareness and training, around incidents response, maintenance, physical protection. So all these things would be more around the operational things. And on the management side of things, where you have planning, risk assessment, and all these things would come under management side of things. So again, we are not going to detailed discussion of each of these steps because those are more more specific to more enterprise environment type thing, which you may do further studies if that is necessary. But as a basic understanding of how you may encounter these cloud environments or some of the roles that you may go into, these could be some of the skills or some of the capabilities that would be utilized in an overall environment for securing cloud infrastructures. So again, here we sort of summarize some of those vulnerabilities that we previously sort of identified in a bit more detail. So we talked about insecure interfaces and APIs. So the different APIs where we have either we may have weak credentials, insufficient authorization checks, or data validation is not performed correctly. So those are some of the things around insecure interfaces and APIs. Then if allocation of resources is incorrectly done, then that could be an issue. Around data and what happens to data is another key aspects of vulnerabilities that we can have. There could be vulnerabilities specifically around the virtual machines. How the virtual machines are provisioned, so all these things, there could be vulnerabilities there. There could be vulnerabilities in the images that are used to create those virtual machines, because like we will have these images that we will use to provision these virtual machines. So there could be some specific vulnerabilities there. So that could be an issue. There could be vulnerabilities in the hypervisors that we have to run those virtual machines. Then we also have these virtual networks interconnecting these virtual machines. Again, there we can have certain additional vulnerabilities in those virtual bridges that are interconnecting these virtual machines. And when we think about sort of specific threats that are targeted towards cloud computing, there we can identify things like account or service hijacking, particularly around data. We can have a number of issues. Again, VMs can have certain issues. So I'm not going to go into detail of each of these things. You can refer to this later, this list later, but there could be a number of specific threats that we can identify as well. And then you can also see some relationships between these different threats and vulnerabilities, and also how some of those countermeasures can be had in those environments. So again, I would actually advise you to check these slides once they are available on LMS. So as a final note, when we think about cloud computing environments, and when we think about whether cloud computing environments are secure, or cloud computing environments can be used in a secure manner in an enterprise environment, the answer is they can be secure as with any other computing environment, and they can always have vulnerabilities or potential for attacks, and we'll have to manage and mitigate them. So that's the best way to look at it. So we can employ many different control mechanisms, many different defense mechanisms, and based on our needs as well, like what type of application we are thinking about, what type of enterprise environment we are thinking about, and then we will choose some of the countermeasures or different sets of countermeasures, mitigation techniques, and things like that to manage the security needs of those environments. But unique to cloud computing environments, we may have certain additional threats because they are these interconnected resources, they have broad network access and so on. So again, they will have some additional challenges stemming from that, and that we will have to somehow manage. And these days, with the more sort of adoption of much wider use of cloud computing, we are coming to identify a number of best practices, a number of common challenges, and how we can mitigate those things are also becoming common knowledge. So we can further learn, and it is a space that needs a constant updating and constant learning, as with any other aspects of security. It is an area where you don't essentially learn much prior to. You have some basics, and but the real threats and the countermeasures and what you need to do to mitigate things, you'll have to learn once things go wrong. For example, like say in recent times, you may have heard about Log4j and how that has affected a large number of computing resources that are connected to the internet, and nobody plans for that until those vulnerabilities are identified and threats are targeting those vulnerabilities. Then you go about addressing those. So you have to have that mindset when you're working in this space. So as a summary, in a way, cloud computing takes control away from organizations because we are depending on these service providers to do a significant component of the overall computing, overall management of our computing resources. But then we also need to find some balance and find some of the key aspects or to focus on to make sure that our overall computing assets, computing resources are secure and protected. So that's about it for the discussion on cloud computing. Are there any questions or anything to be discussed? Any thoughts to share? Maybe any experiences you have had with cloud computing? If there's nothing, we may conclude for the day. And next week, you will again have another lab session with Mr. Surat, and we will continue with another lecture probably the week after next or after that.